collaboration with Hull Performing Arts. A version of this production has been done for about the last 15 years in Hull. We've collaborated the last two, or would have been three, the COVID, the whole thing. And we're so excited to be doing this with them. But just a few things before we start. We ask that you please silence your cell phones. The restrooms are through the door to your left and straight ahead. It's a little dark back there, you have to go back there, so and just be careful when you're going back there. Emergency exits where you came in and to these two sides. There's no smoking in the building or on the building grounds. If you like what you see tonight, please go on our Facebook page, drop us a line, tell us you enjoyed it, tell your friends. We're back here again tomorrow night. Look on our website. We just launched it maybe 6 or 7 months ago. Brand new site with so much stuff. Become a member. Very inexpensive. With your membership, we'll entitle you to discounts for programs like this and to everything else that we do. We had a wonderful program last weekend. The Blades sold out in like 3 days. 250 people. Those are the kind of things that we do. So find out more about us. Sign up for the newsletter. Sign up on Facebook. If you want to leave your email address, we'll send you out for everything that's going on. There'll be about a 10-minute intermission between acts. You're welcome to water and some snacks. Donations are greatly appreciated. And I think that's all we need to know. So please, sit back. Oh, what did I forget? Oh, clapping. We know you want to, there'll be thunderous applause.
Probably standing ovation.
That's what we figured. But please hold it till the end, so we can keep the stories going, keep the spookiness. And someone told me as they came in, they heard an owl right outside here.
Yep.
So I went out and I heard the owl. Quite exciting. I think he's probably here because he wants to get us all in the mood. So please enjoy this evening.
From the beautiful shoreline, unique shops, and historic landmarks, Scituate, Massachusetts appears to be like any other coastal New England community. But in the shadows, spirits of the past still linger. This is the story of the Lawson estate. Thomas Lawson was known as the Copper King. He was a Boston stock promoter and made his fortune through highly dubious stock manipulations. In 1901, he began construction of a luxurious estate south of Boston. In record time, it was completed in 1902. The 1,000-acre estate named Dreamwall included an 800-foot horse stable with second-story dormitories, dog kennels, barns, a post office, and even a fire department. With 65 buildings in all, the estate was the focal point of the turn-of-the-century Scituate, Massachusetts. Dreamwall was meant to be the summer home for Lawson, his wife Jeannie, and 6 children. Thomas also built a smaller house adjacent to the main house called the Nest. This was to be Jeannie's sanctuary from the daily activities of the manor house. Having been infirm most of her life, Jeannie died in 1906. After her death, Thomas made several bad business decisions and lost his entire empire. The Lawson estate was auctioned off in 1922. It was purchased by a group of investors with the idea of building a lavish resort. The plan, however, fell through. In 1925, heartbroken and penniless, Thomas Lawson died. The estate remained uninhabited for years, save for a few private entities. Included on that list was Sunlight House, a summer residence for the blind, and Chase's Wild Animal Farm. In late 1960s, the estate was purchased by longtime Scituate resident Lou Ward and used as a function hall. It was Lou Ward's daughter, Moira, who recalls some strange, unexplained happenings. There were instances when the old weighted kitchen windows would open and close on their own. Lights would turn on and off by themselves. When Moira was around 11, she witnessed the sound of heavy footsteps, followed by childlike lighter ones. She saw one of the stationary bar seats in the cocktail lounge spin wildly without reason. Moira's most frightening experience happened when she was a teenager. She and her father were showing the function hall to a client. Moira was standing a short distance from the heavy swinging doors that divided the kitchen and the cocktail lounge. The door was several hundred pounds and hard to push. Suddenly it flew open, and through it a green, glowing cloud in the shape of a man appeared. The air in the room became bone-chillingly cold as the apparition passed them by. May Litchfield's family had worked on the Lawson estate from the time it had been built. May recalls eerie episodes as well. One of the many occasions was when she witnessed a can of tomatoes move off the kitchen shelf, as if someone was taking it down. Just as quickly, it was then put back on the shelf as if they had changed their mind. Robert Chessier, widely recognized authority on the Lawson estate, recounts a story his aunt used to tell when she was young. She and her friend were exploring Mrs. Lawson's personal chambers. Once in the room, the door abruptly slammed shut, locking the girls inside. They tried feverishly to open the door, but it would not budge. And then, just as suddenly as it had closed, it opened again. Terrified, they ran out and never returned. Those who have reported these peculiar experiences agree that the cold spots in the kitchen, unexplained noises, and his strong male presence must belong to the spirit of Thomas Lawson. How does one really know whose spirit goes bump in the night? Do you?
So many brave and strong female voices have been silenced. I am not perhaps as heroic as they, but I submit to you that my treatment is equally unfair. I am Anne Hibbins, and I have the dubious honor of having been tried twice for the same crime. I was a good wife, a devoted mother, and a respected member of Boston's upper class until I was condemned as a witch and hanged from the grand old oak tree in Boston. My ordeal began when, through no fault of his own, my husband's prosperous businesses and affairs failed. It was undoubtedly my finest hour when I proceeded to publicly condemn and blame our friends and acquaintances for our misfortune. As well, I was quite expressive concerning their private affairs. This they did not appreciate. My sharp tongue in wit, which had previously been so celebrated, now got the best of me, and I was quite despised. Inevitably, I was branded as a witch. Some even said that I was able to transform into all manner of beasts. Eventually, I was jailed. My poor husband, a heartbroken pauper, was unable to bear the shame, disgrace, and humiliation. He died within a year. My brother, who might have helped me, turned his back, and my 3 sons, ashamed, moved away. After some time in prison, I was dragged from my cell and tried for my alleged crimes. However, to my utter astonishment, I was not convicted. You can well imagine how unpopular that particular verdict was. So after immense public pressure, I was put on trial yet again. This time was to be before the bar of the General Court. In the presence of the assembly, I was asked whether or not I was guilty of being a witch. I am not guilty, I replied firmly, and I am willing to be tried before God and the court. The evidence was read again, and after the witnesses were heard, the court retired briefly for deliberation. I was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. My husband's old friends tried to sway the court, but to no avail. On the day of placed around my neck, and I step off into eternity. A thorough search and examination was made of my body, but no telltale marks were found. Likewise, a thorough, face-saving, and frantic search of my house was made in the hopes that they would find some evidence that proved or at least suggested that I could possibly in fact be a witch. That hunt ended in failure. Books, baskets, and chests were ransacked, but no images, puppets, or any other evidence was ever found that could prove me to be a witch. Many have said that those who followed most ardently in my condemnation were afterwards observed to be specially marked for judgment of divine providence. Now, I have no personal knowledge of any unfortunate accidents that may have befallen my persecutors. How could I? After all, I was quite dead.
He would often go far out of his way at night to avoid passing in the vicinity of ghosts or goblins. One night, however, there was a husking bee of great magnitude 2 miles from his house, and he kept spirits up by pouring spirits down. By the time the dance had ended, he had sufficient false courage to walk right by Coronation Rock, and this he started out to do. Approaching the rock, he noticed a glow in the trees, and then heard a fiddle furiously playing. Pushing his way through the thicket, he soon heard the shuffle of feet. A minute later, he was at the rock itself. It was such a sight as he had never seen before. Extremely anxious to shake a leg in a jig or a reel, he could not miss a chance like this. Entering the clearing all smiles, he was welcomed with a shout. On a mossy hammock sat a maid without a partner, a maid whose black eyes snapped with mischief and whose cheeks and lips were rosy. Tom caught her up by the waist, dragged her to her feet, and whirled off with her into the gayest, wildest dance he had ever led. He seemed to soar above the earth. After a time, Tom found that others had seated themselves and were watching him and the maid. This put him on his mettle, and the violin soon gave a lightning to his heels. And he and the girl separated for a matter of 6 feet and set to dance each other down. As he leaped and whirled and cracked his feet in the air in the ecstasy of motion, Tom noticed that the freshness was leaving his partner's face. Her features were becoming longer, the eyes deeper and harder. He was dismayed when he saw that the eyes had turned green and evil. The teeth had begun to project sharp and yellow below the lip, and her form had grown lank and withered. He realized with a shock that it was the demon crew of the hill with which he was in company. His heart grew heavy. Now he could barely leap, but leap he must, for he was lost to the forces of evil unless he could keep up the dance until sunrise, or unless a clergyman should order him to stop. He flung off his coat, hat, vest, and tie and settled into a steady jog. The moon began to set, and he knew that in 2 hours he'd be free. Then a cramp caught him in the calf, and with a roar of "God save me!" for a witch cannot enjoy the name of God. He saw a brief vision of scurrying forms. He heard growling, hissing, and cursing in strange languages, and realized for a second that a hideous shape hung threateningly over him. When he recovered, he found 2 portraits of the witch he danced with etched in fire on the handle of his jackknife. One as she appeared when he met her, and the other as she looked when his eyes were closing. Shortly after he got home, Tom became ill. When he regained his health, he took to himself a wife, joined a church, forsook all entertainment, drank tea, and became a steady workman. He recovered his peace of mind, died a deacon, and was rewarded by having a cherub with a toothache sculptured on his gravestone.
During the Revolutionary War, there was a wealthy farmer named Peter Rupp. He was as well known to his neighbors for his open chaise drawn by that fine black stallion as he was for his terrible temper. In one of his rages, they said he had no regard for any in heaven or in earth. It happened that he and his daughter were coming back from Boston when it started to storm. He stopped at a friend of his, Mr. Cutter's, hoping that the storm would pass, but instead it worsened. Determined that he would go home, he started to leave, but Mr. Cutter said, "Please don't. The storm is getting worse. You're in an open carriage. Think of your daughter. She might perish." Now, furious, Rupp collected his daughter and thundered this oath: "Let the tempest rage. I will get home this night, or I will never get home again at all." Well, he did not get home that night, or the next, or the next. On stormy nights, Catherine Rupp and her neighbors would sometimes hear a chaise clattering on the street, maybe pulling in at the Rupp house, but to no avail. Some years later, the house was bought by Mrs. Betsy Croft. On a particularly rainy night, she answered a knock at the door to find a drenched, haggard-looking man, and behind him she could see on the street a little pale girl sitting in an open carriage. "I am here to talk to Mrs. Catherine Rupp." Well, Mrs. Croft had to tell him that Catherine Rupp had died many years ago, and she lived there alone. "How can you deceive me so? The street has changed. This town has changed. And strangest of all, Catherine Rupp has abandoned her husband and daughter." Collecting himself, however, he asked for directions back to Boston. When he was told to cross the Charles River Bridge, he stopped. There's a ferry crossing the Charles, not a bridge. Turning around, he got into the carriage and disappeared off into the night. They say that heaven can mark a man for a trial or a judgment, and I don't know which it was for Peter Rupp, but I'm inclined to pity him. From this time, travelers from Portsmouth, Maine, all the way down to Bridgeport, Connecticut, would report seeing the open carriage with the grim, haggard man driving a big black horse and a pale little girl sitting next, always with the storm hard on their heels or sometimes overtaking them. One of these sightings is preserved in my family. My great-grandfather in Hartford claims he was accosted by Rupp. Man pulled up in the carriage, asking for directions back to Boston, and I would take it kindly if you would show me where the Newburyport Turnpike was. When told he was then in Hartford, and that he had to turn around, he became distraught. How turn around? It's always turn around. Boston shifts with the wind and runs round the compass. Then whipped up his carriage, the black horse's flanks flexing like crow's wings, And my great-grandfather could hear him say, "Ah, that fateful oath." Eventually, the carriage did find the Charles River Bridge and would run across it on stormy nights at full speed and in complete contempt of the fares, the toll collector used to complain. The toll collector decided he was tired of the scofflaw and came up with a plan to get that fare. So on an inclement night, he took his stool and he put it right in the middle of the turnstile and waited. Soon enough, he could hear the clatter of the carriage down the road coming at a tremendous clip. As it neared, the black stallion showed no signs of slowing down, and at the last minute, he had to jump away and in his panic threw the stool, and it went right through the black horse's head, and the carriage disappeared into the night. And no tale tells of seeing them since. Yet.
This story occurred during my tenure aboard the Virginia. It all began when the carpenter, old Mr. Hockington, fell sick and died. The crew was very distraught, as he was a man well respected by everyone. The captain ordered the ship to port, which was only a few days away. The much beloved Hockington would be given a proper burial ashore. As it came to be, the old man was dead for almost 4 days. Our return to port was delayed, as contrary winds were against us. It was then decided that the body of Mr. Hockington should be committed to the deep. I was on the midnight sentry watch that evening when these unnerving events began to occur. I was tending to the lantern of the watch as it began to flicker and fade. I was startled by a loud bang. Instinctively, I clutched the lamp, and the nail on which it hung became loose and dislodged. The lantern fell to the deck and went out. But through the moonlight, I could see that the door of the dead man's cabin had been flung open by what must have been a horrific force. And from the darkened cabin, I could hear a gruff, hollow voice roar, "Give us a light, sentry!" In my fright, I headed to the cockpit ladder and headed up as I could hear heavy footsteps following me. I mustered what courage I had left and stole a glance behind me to see the ghost of Mr. Hockington pursuing. He made his way to the top of the ladder, came out of the darkness and onto the deck. I walked faster, but then so did he. I headed to the foredeck, and the ghost of Mr. Hockington pursued. So I quickly hurried aft and circled around. But it seems that I had doubled back on the apparition, only to see it rise up onto the forecastle where some of the crew had gathered. Soon many of the men became aware of the ghost's presence, including those on the forecastle itself. One of the crew whispered loudly, "I see Tom. I'm blessed if that ain't the old carpenter." Whispers made their rounds around the crew, and soon the forecastle was clear of men. Only the ghost remained. The men now crowded aft to the foredeck. We could see the ghost wavering back and forth and back and forth. Some of the men were chanting, "Carpenter's ghost, Carpenter's ghost." So I hollered out, "Mr. Hockington, is that thee?" The ghost replied, "Yes, sir." I decided that this would be a good time to alert the captain to the events that were occurring. I rushed to the captain's cabin and began frantically knocking on the door. "Captain, the carpenter is out walking the deck." The captain, awoken from his slumber, replied, "What are you on about?" "Captain, sir, the carpenter is on the forecastle." The captain, somewhat irritated, yelled back, "Then let him be on the forecastle and be damned." The captain then returned to his slumber. I then returned to the crew to find that the ghost had made his way to the gathering of the crew on the foredeck. He reached out a wavering hand and pleaded to us, "A drop of water, please." It was then that we realized that it was not a ghost at all, but Mr. Hockington himself, returning from his sick-induced coma-like trance. He had returned to consciousness while awaiting his burial at sea. When later asked, all the carpenter could remember was hearing the sound of the 2 bells strike, signaling the changing of the night watch. As it was his time to turn out and watch, he roused up, called for a light to be cast, fumbled for his clothes, and stumbled out of the cockpit onto the deck, thus starting our frightful night.
Everyone has heard of the Salem witch trials of 1692, but you might be surprised to hear that many women were condemned for speaking their mind, for fighting for their rights, or simply not accepting the norms of the time. About 80 people throughout New England were accused of witchcraft in the 45 years preceding the Salem witch trials. 13 women and 2 men were executed. Margaret Jones was the first person to be executed in Boston for witchcraft, decades before the Salem trial started. Anne Rupp was arrested and tried for witchcraft in 1688. Before the court, Anne's answers could not be understood. Her accusers said it was because she was speaking the language of the devil. In truth, Anne spoke Irish Gaelic, and this was well known. And yet, because she could not speak and recite the Lord's Prayer in English, she was marked as a witch. Anne Glover was the last person to be hanged as a witch, and her case informed many of the Salem witch trials cases. Then there was Goody Cole. She came from Hampton in New Hampshire, and she was the only woman ever convicted of witchcraft in that state. She was formally accused of witchcraft 3 times in her life. The first time was in Boston in 1656. She was in prison for 4 years before they released her. And then we arrested her and kept her in prison for another 6 years. She was acquitted again, but the accusations continued. She was tried twice more as a witch, and both times she was acquitted. But that did not stop them keeping her in prison until she died in 1680. So you see, witchcraft was apparently rampant in New England well before Salem started making history.
In the mid-19th century, my son and I were on a ship bound for the Bahamas, but we never made our destination. We were caught in a hurricane and crashed along the rocky shore of Great Isaac Key. All souls were lost, but one. As the vessel broke apart and in the hopes of saving my child, I wrapped my body around his. My baby miraculously survived. He was found a few days later by sailors who came upon the wreckage. He was still in my arms,
They had to struggle to get him from my grip and slipped him out of his clothing. They walked away that night with my beloved son. My spirit cried out, "My baby! My baby!" I remained on the island for several years, desperately seeking, trying to find my son, looking for answers, but no one was there to help me. When the lighthouse was being built, workers came to live on the island. They could help me. They would answer my prayers. One night, I spotted a worker walking along the beach. I cried out, "My baby! My baby!" The worker stopped, saw me, and ran back to tell the others what he had seen and heard. I tried to call up to several other workers during this time, but each time they would run away. And once the lighthouse was built, they left the island. But then the keeper came to live on the island, and I had new hope. But much like before, he would just flee every time I called. My appearances were often accompanied by a rising moon, and I was spotted on the very part of the beach where my baby had been taken from me. I was known as the Phantom Lady of Great Isaac. And one night, I saw the keeper descending the lighthouse. This was my chance. I went in, knowing that he would have to pass me in order to escape. With my hooded head bent, I slowly started to walk in and ascend the spiral staircase. "My baby! My baby!" The keeper was atop. He was frozen with fear. He couldn't move up or down. I continued. I was now 2 turns away. "My baby! My baby!" I didn't want to frighten him. I just needed help. As I continued, I was now 1 turn away. I could almost reach him. "My baby!" He ran up the turret, slammed the hatch door, and placed a heavy crate on top. "My baby!" I remained in the lighthouse until dawn, when I disappeared, and the lighthouse keeper fled the island. The next keeper was determined to banish me from the island and performed a committal service at dusk on the very part of the beach where I had died so many years before. Sunset service at Great Isaac. I have never been seen or heard from again. At about 10 o'clock that evening, the time came that we should be heading back home, for my sister had stayed behind and was sending the servant Shadwell out to come and collect us at the morgue. My father invited Mr. John Edge to come along with us, and we all went back. Soon we had boarded the canoe with Shadwell and were rowing back toward the island where Boston Light is. Sometime on the way back, though, a very strange thing happened. The canoe flipped, and we all were drowned. Even stranger, when they went to go collect our bodies from the ocean floor, the body of Mr. John Edge was mysteriously missing, as was all of the pay from my father's pocket. Many, many years later, a young man by the name of Russell Anderson, a young Coast Guardsman, had been appointed keeper of Boston Light.
And in 1847, he moved in there with his wife, Maisie. But that's when strange things started to happen on the island. Maisie would be walking along the beach at night when all of a sudden she'd feel as though there was some presence behind her. But when she'd turn around, there was no one there. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Maisie would be awoken to the sound of a man's maniacal laughter emanating from the fog signal from the boathouse. As for me, other times, Maisie would be walking outside when she would hear a young woman screaming from the beach for someone to come save her. Shadow! Shadow! Shadow!
In Scituate, a young surfman out on his first patrol came upon a dead body in the surf. Allowing the seedier side of human nature to trickle in, he did the unthinkable for a man in his position. He went through the corpse's pockets. Finding a silver coin, he took it and slid it into his own pocket. He then headed towards the station to alert the keeper of the need to get a cart in order to haul the body away. When they returned to the site, the body had vanished. The following night, once again, the surfman went out on patrol. Reaching the place where the dead body had been seen the previous evening, he felt a bitter, sharp slap in the side of his face. Stunned, he paused for a moment before warily taking another few steps. A second slap stung him again. In a panic, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the coin, and flung it into the sea. He fled the beach and out of life-saving for good. From Hull to Plymouth and all the beaches of the United States, surfmen faced the possibility of the unexpected every night, with results that sometimes could not be explained.
A Captain Edmund Torrance was given the assignment and he set sail. By sheer coincidence, the ship on which he sailed was wrecked off Sable Island, and he was the sole survivor. Fortunately, by then, the wreckers had moved on, and he found an old shepherd's hut where he was able to take shelter while he waited to be rescued. One night, as he was returning to his hut, having been out to gather some more firewood, he was surprised to see a lady sitting by his fire. She was dripping wet and pale as death. He approached her cautiously, thinking her to be another shipwrecked victim like himself. But as he got closer, he realized he knew the lady. It was Mrs. Copeland. Her husband had been a surgeon on one of the ships on which he had sailed. He asked her what had happened. There was no reply. She merely held up her arm, her hand with the ring finger missing, and blood dripping from the stump onto the dirt floor of the hut. Eventually, through asking questions to which he only received nods and shakes of her head, he pieced together her story that she had been murdered for the ring, and that her desire was that the ring be found and returned to her family. This Captain Torrance promised he would try to do, and after that he never saw her again. In the fullness of time, Captain Torrance was rescued, and he set off on his mission to find out more about the wreckers and to look for the ring. During the course, he took to wearing a very gaudy, cheap ring, because he could bring the conversation round to items like that. And in the course of his investigation, he became acquainted with my grandmother. And one day she invited him back to the house for a meal. Fortunately, my grandfather was not home that time. Because my mother, during the meal, became fascinated by the ring on his finger and asked to admire it more closely. Now, my mother at the time was maybe 7, maybe 8 years old, and like most children that age, she tended to say exactly what she thought. So she admired his ring and then gave it back to him, saying, "It's very pretty, but not nearly as beautiful as the one that Daddy took off the lady's hand on the beach." My grandmother was horrified. She shooed the child from the room and tried to explain that her husband had received the ring from somebody who found it on the beach. Captain Torrance played along and asked if he could see such a fine specimen, only to be told it had been pawned in Halifax. As soon as Captain Torrance and 2 guardsmen were in Halifax, they found the watchmaker who had taken the ring and pawn. Captain Torrance gave him 20 shillings and took the ring, and told him that if anybody ever returned and wanted the ring returned, all they had to do was to find the captain and bring the finger which had been cut off to obtain the ring. That's the last history tells us about Captain Torrance, and the ring has never been seen since either. But if you are on Sable Island one stormy night, you may become one of these elite group of people who have seen the lady roaming the cliffs of the island, searching for her ring and her missing finger.
Second Island Lighthouse was commissioned by Washington in 1795. One of the early lighthouse keepers had a wife, and when they moved there, she quickly became very bored by their isolated life. So he had a piano with some sheet music for a song shipped to the island for her. She loved the song, and she played it. But deliveries to the island were very rare and often delayed, and she only had the one song, and played it over and over until it literally drove her husband mad. He took an axe to the piano, and then he threw her down the well. But he realized she had survived, so he pulled her out, and then she became the axe's next victim. In his madness, he ran to the 185-foot cliffs and threw himself over. But, they say, the sound of that same tune on the piano can be heard through the fog coming from the lighthouse.
My name is Father Edward Rowe. In 1872, Grindstone Island was hit by a terrible blizzard. Shortly after church on Sunday, December 15th, I had just swayed my small congregation with a powerful sermon that was to precede a storm of far greater fury, such that few inhabitants left their home for several days. During a lull in the blizzard, 3 brave young lads ventured down to the shore, where they discovered the wreckage of a ship. When they spent the next several hours gathering salvage, and when their arms were full, they began their walk home. As the sun set, they passed a large mass of debris. Then suddenly, without warning, a gigantic creature, seemingly 8 feet high and snow white, rose up. This incredible creature advanced on them slowly, making guttural, inarticulate sounds. The boys dropped their spoils and fled for home. News of the wreckage spread quickly, and the next morning about 20 men from the village went down to the shore, despite the strange story from the 3 boys. There they worked all day on the wreckage that was once named Calcutta. They were able to salvage several tons of wheat, but very little else. So when evening fell, they lit their flares for their homeward journey. But as they passed the hayloft, an enormous white shape appeared from behind the snowdrifts. This creature was so frightful that every man there dropped what he was holding and fled for home, screaming in terror. When they reached the village, they came to my home to tell me of their fantastic experience. Their vision was so vivid and their fear so deep-seated, there was nothing I could say to comfort them. I reluctantly agreed to return with them to the scene of the encounter. Early the next morning, I was joined by a dozen men, each armed with a gun. After about an hour's walk, we reached the hayloft, where I noticed something that excited me, and I called the others over. They glanced down. They saw several impressions of the strangest footprints, almost 22 inches long and nearly 12 inches wide. What sort of creature could have such a foot? Well, we followed the tracks for some distance. I walked in front of the others, but we were all on alert, guns drawn, ready to fire at whatever the creature might be, bear, giant, or ghost. Evening fell and we lit our flares. Then suddenly, in the distance, we noticed a huge form down on the beach. We approached the gigantic creature cautiously, but I alone advanced towards the creature in the snow. And it was indeed huge, nearly 9 feet in girth, 8 feet wide. I noticed 2 cavities where the eyes should be, but little else, and the entire body was completely covered with ice and snow. Then suddenly, the eyes began to open and close, and a horrible, inarticulate moan rose from the very depths of the creature's soul. Again and again, this anguished cry issued forth. And then the creature's massive arms began to move, feebly at first, but then with greater strength. That's when I leaned over. My overcoat flew open, revealing my Roman collar and silver cross. The creature's movements became more agitated, and its moans more frequent. As I leaned in, the creature made one final attempt and uttered the word, Father. Mon Dieu, men, I shouted. This creature is a man. He's been caught in the blizzard. He's nearly frozen to death. Come on, we'll have to carry him back to the island. Well, several men found a piece of planking, but it took every man there to carry him, for with the combined weight of ice and snow, he weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. The men and women of Grindstone Island worked into the early morning hours, first chipping away at the ice in the exterior, and slowly thawing the portions closest to the flesh with heavy, damp, wet towels. Gradually, a figure emerged, a man, 6 feet 8 inches in height, but without ice and snow, nearly 310 pounds. His enormous physique had kept him alive. This was August Bourdin, first mate of the wheat ship Calcutta, and the only survivor. After the shipwreck, he clung to a piece of debris for a full long day, reaching the shore to find nothing to eat but snow. The sight of my Roman collar and silver cross brought him back to his senses. But his suffering was tremendous, as his limbs thought. His agony made him wish he had died in the wreckage. After about a week, the villagers realized they were going to have to remove his badly frozen legs. It took 10 men to hold him to the table while the amputation began. But he lived. Such is the will of God.
The Glades, 54 acres of private land on Strawberry Point in the mining section of Scituate. It was the summer playground to many prominent Massachusetts families. The Adams, Saltonstall, Ames, Loverings, and many others created their own private oasis called the Glades Club. This is where they and their families would come to rest, rejuvenate, enjoy the stunning views, and breathe the fresh, salty air. The Maid Hotel was built in 1899 and was the heart of the club. It was there that members gathered to play cards on the wide veranda, enjoy quiet moments in the comfortable living room, and meet for meals and functions in the great room. Many years have gone by since its heyday, but the spirits seem to be lingering. On a day which seemed like any other, caretaker Bob Thorndike unlocked the entry gates and made his way to the hotel. He unlocked the front door and started his daily inspection. He entered the dining room and was met with an inconceivable sight. All the dining tables and chairs were missing. Astonished, he went to the kitchen and found the tables and chairs were missing from there as well. Certain that no one had been in the hotel and all the doors had been securely locked, he inspected all the other rooms. When he reached the lower level, he was completely stunned, for there in the great room were all the tables laid end to end. The chairs had been arranged in their proper place about the table, and the table had been set as if there was an elaborate dinner party. Beautiful china and exquisite monogrammed silver adorned the table. Everything perfectly set, right down to the linen napkins. Feeling rather uneasy, Thorndike left the hotel in pursuit of answers. After all, furniture did not magically disappear from one room and reappear in another. Aside from being completely baffled, Bob needed to get everything back into their proper places. He enlisted some local teams to help. 3 days after the incident, Bob and his helpers arrived at the hotel with a large task at hand. Bob's jaw dropped. Everything was back in its proper place. The tables and chairs were back in the dining room and kitchen. The china and silver back in the cabinets. Even the napkins were returned to their drawers. Did the spirits of the past gather for a game of cards? Perhaps they were relaxing on the veranda before assembling for a fine meal amongst old friends. I guess we may never know.
For as long as anyone can remember, the people of Massachusetts South Shore have witnessed horrific shipwreck disasters. Early volunteers vowed to save the lives of mariners in distress, which led the way to the United States Life-Saving Service. From Hull to Plymouth, surfmen, as they were called, patrolled the beaches for shipwrecks and other disasters. Yet bad weather and stormy seas were not their only danger. Once, while walking from Port Allerton, surfman Fernando Bierce was beaten, robbed, and forced to run for his life. In later years, this would happen again to other surfmen. For example, a young Coast Guardsman was kidnapped and beaten by rum runners along the Minot coastline. Another incident involved Joseph L. Wixon of the Gurnet Life Saving Station. He hadn't completed his watch along Duxbury Beach. His station keeper, Augustus Rogers, strolled out into the night to find him. Wixon's kerosene lantern had exploded, knocking him unconscious. His leg was bleeding profusely. He awoke and lurched around like a zombie. Bleary-eyed and bloody, Wixon stumbled along in the darkness until station keeper Rogers found him. These instances are all explained. But what about the instances that cannot be explained? One cold, dark night in January 1898, a surfman from Point Allerton Station was stopped in his tracks at the base of Southers Hill. He shined his lantern towards the sea and watched a woman in black dress walk across the water towards him. Panicked, he took a few steps backwards as she strode alongside him. When he turned back towards the station and ran, he looked over his shoulder to see her now floating across the water towards George's Island. Keeper Joshua James, the most decorated lifesaver in American history, would have nothing to do with ghost stories. The following day, he assigned a different surfman to take the midnight patrol. That night, the surfman returned with a similar tale of haunting. A woman dressed in black floated off the water and then back again. On the third night, James sent yet another surfman, but he came back with the same results. Every night for the next 2 weeks, Joshua James sent his men out in pairs, and each night they scurried back, saying that she had returned yet again. Then, just as the surfmen were coming to expect her nightly appearance, she vanished for good and was never seen again.
My beloved Samuel and I had been married only a few weeks before he and his regiment were captured by Yankee soldiers at Roanoke Island. They locked those boys up like animals in some God-forsaken place in the middle of Boston Harbor. But my Samuel, he's so clever. He managed to get word of his whereabouts through the Underground Railroad. I knew what I had to do. I booked passage on a ship sailing for Hull, Massachusetts. Once there, I secured room and board with some family friends who were Southern sympathizers. My Samuel was being held by Colonel Dimmock of Fort Warren out on George's Island. From Hull, I could sit and observe the sentries guarding the fort. I watched for weeks. After a while, I knew their routines better than they did. I only needed the perfect opportunity to present itself. I didn't have long to wait. On one particularly dark and stormy night, my southern hosts dressed me like a Union soldier and armed me with a pepper-pot pistol. I rowed myself out to the island, and I hid my skiff under some brush near the beach. And then I held my breath and prayed. If I were caught, it would mean certain death. I was terrified. I waited a while, and then I realized I needn't a word at all. Those soldiers were too busy trying to keep warm and cowered from the storm like the dogs that they are. I slipped into the shadows, and I made my way to a ditch just below the corridor of gunmen without a challenge. I whistled a tune that I knew my Samuel would recognize from our childhood. Moments later, a rope was dropped, and I was hoisted up through the musketry loophole. There he stood. I could barely discern a pale, gaunt figure before me. Still, it was my Samuel, and we embraced for the first time in what seemed like a century. But scarce was the time. We had to plan our escape. I managed to smuggle in a small pick and shovel. The prisoners devised a cunning scheme to dig toward the interior of the garrison, overpower the soldiers, and take Fort Warren or the South. They dug day and night, all the while keeping me hidden. Then it all went terribly wrong. There was a miscalculation. One of the men accidentally struck the granite wall of the gunpowder magazine with a pick. The sound was akin to that of a cannon blast. It just echoed off the walls of the tunnel, and those Union boys were there to flash. And that's when I found myself face to face with that loathsome content. Oh, but I was not afraid. No, I still had my pistol. I took it from my pocket, and I aimed at his abhorrent face. And I pulled the trigger. But it didn't go down. He should have been destroyed. Not my Samuel. You see, the barrel of the pistol exploded in my hands and red hot metal flew everywhere. And a piece, no bigger than my fingernail, hit my Samuel in the head, and it tore through his brain. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. He just lay there, so still, dead. Oh, they strung me up for treason. They granted me one last request. So I told them I did not wish to die wearing one of their vile Yankee uniforms. I am, after all, a Southern lady. So they gave me this beautiful, breathtaking, heart-stopping black clover. Many unfortunates have seen me in my black cloak, wandering along the walls, walking through the halls of Fort Warren. I wonder who'll be next.